Story 1. My name is Dale Whitfield, and I drove freight trains for a living for over 2 decades, mostly on the CSX lines that cut through the Appalachian spine between West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. If you have never ridden a freight train through those mountains at night, I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened to me. Those tracks were laid 100 and some years ago by men blasting through rock with dynamite, cutting notches into ridgelines that nothing living was ever meant to pass through easily. You go through tunnels that swallow the headlamp whole. You cross trestles that hang over black water you cannot see the bottom of. And for miles at a time, there is nothing around you but forest, so thick it looks like a solid wall, even in winter when the leaves are gone. I want to be honest with you, I never believed in any of that folklore stuff. I grew up in Beckley, and my grandmother used to talk about things she called haints and things in the woods that would call your name to get you to walk off the path. And I always figured that was just old mountain talk, stories people told to keep their kids close to the porch light. I do not think that anymore. Before that night, I'd run that particular stretch of track probably close to 400 times over the years, at every hour, every season, and nothing about it had ever struck me as different from any other stretch of Appalachian rail line, aside from the ordinary caution any experienced engineer keeps up around blind curves and tunnel mouths. I mention that only because I want you to understand this was not a route I was unfamiliar with, not some new assignment where nerves might have gotten the better of me. I knew that grade, that creek bed, that tunnel, better than I knew most roads I drove for pleasure. And none of that familiarity did a single thing to prepare me for what came out of the tree line that night. It was late October, I remember, because we were hauling a mixed freight consist, mostly coal cars but a few intermodal containers mixed in, heading north out of a yard near Welch. It gets dark early that time of year in the mountains because the ridges block the sun long before actual sunset. So by 5:30 in the evening, you are running lights the whole way. My conductor that night was a younger guy, maybe 26, named Tobias Grant. Good kid, quiet, had only been running that particular route for about 8 months. We were maybe 2 hours into the run, working our way along a stretch that parallels a creek bed for about 11 miles before the line cuts through a ridge tunnel. I noticed it first as a smell. Now, anybody who has spent time in the woods knows that wild animals have a smell. Deer have a certain musk to them. Bear have a heavier, almost sweetish rot smell if they have been eating carrion. This was not that. This was something like wet fur mixed with something sour, almost like spoiled milk. And it was strong enough that it came through the cab even with the windows shut, and the diesel exhaust from our own engine competing with it. Tobias smelled it too. He made a face and asked me if something had died near the tracks, maybe a deer we had already hit further back. I did not think much of it until I saw movement along the tree line to our right, pacing us. At first I told myself it was a dog, maybe a coyote, something running the grade because it was easier footing than the brush. But the thing about running alongside a freight train is that you are going anywhere from 15 to 35 miles an hour, depending on grade. And no dog, no coyote, nothing on 4 legs that I've ever heard of keeps pace with the train for any real distance. This thing kept pace with us for what felt like almost 2 miles, weaving in and out of the tree line. And every time it crossed a gap in the trees where the moon or our headlamp caught it, I got a little more of a look and a little more of a bad feeling low in my gut. It was running upright some of the time and down on all 4s other times, switching between the two like it did not matter to it which way was more efficient. Its fur, from what I could see in flashes, was a dirty grayish white, patchy in places like it was molting or mangy. And even over the sound of the engine and the wheels on the rail, I started to hear something else, a kind of high-pitched sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a howl, more like something trying to imitate a scream without quite having the right kind of throat for it. I have talked to old-timers since then, men who grew up in those hollers their whole lives, and more than one of them, when I described what I saw, got very quiet and told me I was describing something they call the wampus cat. Though the way they described it to me was not the sleek mountain lion-looking thing you sometimes see in cartoon drawings online. The way the old men described it to me was uglier, wrong-headed. Something that used to be an animal and used to be a person both, cursed into a shape that does not sit right on it, which would explain why it kept switching between 2 legs and 4, like its own body could not decide what it was supposed to be. Tobias saw it too, and I want to be clear about that because I do not want anyone thinking I imagined this alone in a rocking train cab at midnight. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark and said, "Dale, what in the hell is that?" And I did not have an answer for him. His voice cracked on the word that in a way I'd never heard from him before, even during a close call we had a few months earlier with a stalled truck on a grade crossing. And hearing that particular kind of fear in a coworker's voice did more to convince me this was real than my own eyes had managed up to that point. We were coming up on the tunnel by then, a long bore cut through solid rock that takes almost 90 seconds to clear at freight speed. One of those places where cell signal drops completely and the radio gets nothing but static. And the thing along the tree line put on a burst of speed I did not think was possible for anything built like that. And it beat us to the tunnel mouth. I remember thinking, in the strange, half-detached way your mind sometimes works under real fear, that whatever this thing was, it understood the geography of that mountain better than any map the railroad had ever given me, cutting a straight line through terrain that would have taken a person or an ordinary animal several times longer to cross on foot. If you are new here, this is where I want to remind you. If this story is getting to you, drop a comment and let us know, because we read every single one. And if you want more stories like this delivered every week, subscribing costs you nothing, and it means everything to a small channel like ours. Now, back to it, because it gets worse. When we hit the tunnel mouth, our headlamp swept across the opening and caught the thing standing there, upright this time, easily 7 feet tall if it was standing straight, though it was hunched forward in a way that made it hard to judge exactly. Its face was the worst part. I have turned this over in my head for 3 years now trying to find better words for it, and I still cannot. It was shaped roughly like a cat's face, if you can imagine a cat's face stretched and elongated, and put on a human-sized skull, with a mouth that hung slightly open, showing teeth that did not look like they belonged to any single animal. Some flat like a person's molars, and some long and curved like a predator's. Its eyes caught our headlamp and threw it back yellow-green, the way a deer's eyes do, except deer eyes look startled, and this thing's eyes did not look startled at all. They looked like they were measuring us. We went into the tunnel doing about 28 miles an hour, and I swear to you that thing kept pace alongside the train, inside that tunnel, running along the narrow maintenance ledge that runs along one side for workers. And I could hear it, over the engine, over the wheels, screaming that not quite human scream the entire 90 seconds we were in there. And it was close enough at points that I could see, in the strobing light off the tunnel wall lighting, its ribs through patchy fur, its long fingered hands with claws that scraped against the rock wall as it ran, leaving sparks in a couple places where I think the claws were hard enough to strike the stone. At one point, maybe halfway through the tunnel, it turned its head toward the cab window and looked directly at me. And I want you to understand that I have been in dangerous situations on the railroad before. Derailments, equipment failures, close calls with vehicles stuck on crossings, and none of them ever put the kind of fear in me that a single look from that thing did. Its eyes held on mine for what was probably only a second or two, but felt like it stretched out much longer. And in that look, I did not see mindless animal hunger the way you might expect. I saw something closer to recognition, like it knew exactly what it was looking at, knew exactly what a man in a train cab was, and had simply decided, for reasons of its own, not to do anything about it that particular night. Tobias described the same thing afterward, though he said the look lasted longer for him, closer to 4 or 5 seconds by his estimate, and he said it made a specific point of shifting its gaze from him to me and back again, almost like it was comparing us, deciding something between the two of us that neither of us will ever know the answer to. Tobias had his hand on the emergency brake the entire time, and I told him not to touch it, because stopping a loaded coal train inside a mountain tunnel with that thing outside the cab was the single worst idea either of us could have had. And to his credit, shaking as bad as he was, he did not touch it. We came out the other side of that tunnel, and the thing was gone. Not slowing down and falling behind, gone, just gone, like it had peeled off into the rock itself. We did not stop the train until we hit the next yard almost 40 minutes later. And when we did stop, Tobias got out and was sick beside the tracks. And I do not blame him one bit, because my hands did not stop shaking until well into the next day. I filed an incident report that night that I did not put a single word of the truth into. I wrote that we thought we saw a large animal near the tracks and left it at that, because I did not want to be the freight engineer who got pulled off duty for a psych evaluation over what I actually saw. Tobias transferred to a different division within 4 months. We do not talk about that night. We have talked maybe twice since it happened, and both times it was short, and neither of us wanted to go into detail, like saying too much out loud might call it back. I still run freight, though I requested a permanent transfer off that particular line, and the railroad, without asking too many questions, let me have it. There is a stretch of track in that part of West Virginia that I will not go back to if I have any say in the matter. And if you ever find yourself driving along a rural highway that runs parallel to old rail lines cut through Appalachian Mountains at night, and you smell something like wet fur and spoiled milk, and you see something pacing you in the tree line that cannot decide if it wants to run on 2 legs or 4, do not slow down, do not stop, and do not look at it any longer than you have to, because I am convinced that thing was measuring us for something the whole time it ran alongside that train, and I do not ever want to find out what it was measuring us for. To this day, when I drive past the entrance to that rail yard on my way to a different assignment, I glance toward that stretch of track, out of habit, half expecting, half dreading, to see a patchy grayish-white shape waiting somewhere just inside the tree line, patient the way only something that has been doing this for a very long time can afford to be patient. A few months after it happened, I got curious enough to do some digging of my own, mostly late at night when I could not sleep anyway. I found an old newspaper clipping, scanned into a local historical society archive, from sometime in the 1950s, describing livestock losses along that same stretch of ridge. Sheep and goats found dead with injuries. The article described only as unusual, and a brief mention of a farmer who claimed to have seen, in his own words, as quoted in the piece, a critter that ran like a man some of the time and a cat the rest, which was close enough to what I saw that reading it alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m. put a chill straight through me that took a long while to shake off. I also reached out carefully, and without giving too many details up front, to a small regional folklore group online. People who collect and archive exactly this kind of story from around the mountains. A woman who moderates that group told me she had received at least 4 other reports over the years, describing something matching what I saw, always along rail lines or old logging roads that cut through dense, undisturbed forest, always at night, and always described as pacing whatever vehicle the witness was in for a distance, before either vanishing or making some kind of aggressive move toward the tunnel or bridge crossing ahead. She told me the pattern suggested to her that whatever this creature is, it seems tied to specific travel corridors through the mountains, choke points like tunnels and bridges, rather than roaming freely across open territory the way a normal predator would. I do not know what to do with that information except to pass it along to you now. Tobias, for what it is worth, still works for the railroad, just on a different division entirely, running lines through flatter country in Ohio where nothing has ever paced his train. We exchanged a few messages a while back, and he told me he still keeps a rosary his grandmother gave him, clipped to his visor, something he never used to do before that night. And he told me plainly that he does not care if it does anything or not. He is not taking the chance of finding out the hard way twice. There is one more thing I've never told anyone outside my own household, and I'm only sharing it now because I think it matters for anyone who spends time near old rail corridors in that part of the country. About a year after the incident, I was driving my own truck off the clock along a state highway that runs parallel to a different stretch of that same rail line, much further south, closer to the Virginia border, and I caught for only a second or two in my headlights a shape moving low along the shoulder of the road before it cut back into the brush. The same patchy grayish-white coat, the same wrongness to how it moved. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I kept my eyes forward and my foot steady on the gas, and I did not tell my wife about it until almost 3 days later, mostly because I did not know how to say it out loud without it sounding like something my own mind had conjured up out of leftover fear from the first encounter. She believed me without hesitation, which honestly meant more to me than I expected it to. And she has asked me since to consider a different line of work entirely, something that keeps me further from those tracks, a request I have thought about seriously more than once. For now, I keep running, mostly because the pension math does not favor an early exit, and mostly, if I'm honest, because some stubborn part of me does not want to let a creature I cannot even properly explain to my own supervisors dictate the shape of the rest of my career. But I keep a spotlight mounted in the cab now that I did not carry before, and I keep it aimed at the tree line more nights than I would like to admit. And Tobias, last I heard, does the same thing on his own runs up in Ohio, flatland or not. If this story got under your skin even a little, that is exactly what we are here for. Make sure you are subscribed to Park Ranger Files so you do not miss what is coming next. Drop a like on this video because it genuinely helps the channel grow. And tell us in the comments if you have ever had something pace you on a road or a rail line at night. We read all of them. We will see you in the next one. Story 2. My name is Renee Castellano, and for 11 years, I worked as a home health aide out of a small agency based in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. My job was to drive out to elderly and disabled clients scattered across some of the most rural parts of that county. Some of them living so far back in the hollers that GPS did not even recognize the road. And I would help with medication, bathing, meals, whatever the client needed to stay in their own home instead of a facility. I loved that job. I want that on record before I tell you what happened, because after this I could not do it anymore, and I still grieve that a little. I had a client, an elderly man named Elwood Pruitt, who lived alone about 40 minutes outside of Marlinton, up a gravel road that climbed steadily for the last 2 miles before it reached his property. He had emphysema and needed help twice a day, morning and evening, and I had been seeing him for almost a year before anything strange happened. Over that year, I'd come to genuinely enjoy our visits, well beyond the professional obligation of the job, since Elwood had a dry sense of humor and a memory for local history that made even routine medication checks feel like sitting down with a favorite uncle rather than clocking in for a shift. He was a quiet man, sharp-minded despite his body failing him, and he used to tell me little bits about growing up in that same holler, about his father and grandfather before him, and how they always kept a rifle loaded by the door. Not for people, he told me once, but for something he only ever called the wool thing. He told me it had taken a calf from his father's small herd back when he himself was still a boy. Found the next morning dragged nearly 40 yards from the pasture fence, with injuries his father refused to describe to him in any detail, beyond saying it was not the work of any coyote or bear, and that his father had walked the fence line with that loaded rifle every single evening for the rest of that year without ever firing a single shot, as if the mere presence of him standing guard had been enough to keep it from coming back closer than the tree line. I did not think much of it at the time. Old men in the mountains say a lot of things, and I had heard enough regional folklore working that job to fill a book, most of it harmless porch talk. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when I made my evening visit, already dark by the time I got there because the sun drops early behind those ridges, In Elwood's dog, an old blue heeler named Scout, who normally met my car barking, was nowhere to be found. Elwood was agitated in a way I had not seen from him before, sitting near the window with the lights off, watching the tree line. He told me Scout had been barking at something out past the fence line for almost an hour before going dead silent, which he said was worse than the barking. I want to describe to you what I saw when I stepped back outside to check on the dog, because I have never told this part to anyone besides my husband and one other coworker who eventually believed me after something similar happened to her. Standing at the edge of Elwood's yard, maybe 60 feet off, was something in the approximate size and build of a large ram, but standing on its hind legs with thick, matted white wool covering most of its body except around a face that was not a sheep's face at all. It had a long jaw, more like a wolf or a bear, and small dark eyes set too close together, and even from that distance I could smell it. A heavy animal musk mixed with something almost like burnt hair. I remember gripping the doorframe hard enough that a splinter went into my palm, a small, stupid pain that somehow anchored me in the moment and kept me from either bolting back inside too fast or freezing up entirely. And I've wondered since whether that little jolt of physical pain is the only reason I was able to think clearly enough to get myself and Elwood safely locked inside before things got any worse. I have since learned, from talking to people who study this regional folklore, that this matches descriptions of something called the sheep squatch. Said to roam parts of West Virginia, particularly the areas around the Boone County and Greenbrier region, described almost exactly the way I am describing it to you now, long before I ever heard that word myself. Some of the older accounts I read afterward described it as having a strange coloration around the lower legs, almost like it had waded through something dark and staining. And I want to tell you that when I finally got a clearer look at its legs in the moment before it moved, they did appear discolored in exactly that way, a detail I had not read about until well after that night, and could not have simply imagined into my own memory after the fact. If you're watching this alone tonight with the lights off, maybe turn one on, because it does not get easier from here. And hey, if you want to support what we do here at Park Ranger Files, dropping a comment with your own encounter helps more than you know. We read every single one, and sometimes we turn them into full episodes. All right, back to Elwood's yard. The thing did not move for what felt like a very long time, just stood there watching the house, watching me, I think. And I remember being frozen in the doorway, unable to make myself go further out or retreat back in. Some animal part of my brain telling me that sudden movement was the wrong choice. Then I heard it make a sound, and I want to be precise here because this detail matters. It was not a bleat, and it was not a growl. It was closer to a woman screaming, high and ragged, cut off abruptly like someone clamped a hand over its mouth mid-scream. Elwood from inside told me later he had heard that exact sound 3 times in his life. Once when he was a boy, once when his father died, and once that night. I got back inside and locked the door, and Elwood, calm in a way that unsettled me more than if he had panicked, told me to turn off every light in the house, which I did. Elwood's hands were shaking as badly as mine were by that point, and I remember thinking, even in the middle of my own fear, how strange it was to see a man who had faced down a failing body and a terminal diagnosis with total calm, now trembling over something outside a window. We sat in the dark for almost 2 hours. I could hear it moving around the outside of the house at points, something heavy dragging along the siding. At one point, what sounded like claws or hooves on the porch steps, testing them, I think, the way an animal tests ice before committing its full weight. It never tried the door. I do not know why. Elwood said his father always claimed the thing would not cross a threshold if there was salt laid across it, and it turned out Elwood had laid a line of salt across every doorway in that house years before I ever started working for him, which I had genuinely never noticed until that night, thinking it was just a strange elderly habit, like something you would find on those internet posts about odd things old folks do. At one point during those 2 hours in the dark, I heard it come up close to the window nearest where I was sitting, close enough that I could hear its breathing distinctly, over the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears, slow and deep and deliberate. And then I heard it scrape something, maybe a claw, maybe a hoof, slowly down the length of the glass, a sound that has stayed lodged in my memory more vividly than almost anything else from that night. Elwood reached over in the dark and took my hand without a word, and we sat like that, gripping each other's hands like two people much younger than either of us, until the scraping finally stopped and moved on to somewhere else around the house. Around 10 that night, the sounds outside stopped completely, and about 20 minutes after that, Scout the dog came scratching weakly at the back door, alive but with several long gashes along his side that required an emergency vet visit that night. Wounds the vet described as consistent with something with either very sharp claws or teeth, though notably wider set than any coyote or bobcat native to the area could produce. I kept working for Elwood for another 8 months after that, and the thing never came back while I was there, though he told me in a conversation about 2 months before he passed away from his illness that it had come back twice more when I was not present, both times in winter, both times leaving that same scream in the dark. I do not know if it was hunting him specifically, or if it was something that simply passed through that holler on some kind of cycle, but I have never been able to shake the memory of those small dark eyes watching the house, patient in a way that no ordinary animal is patient. I left home health work about a year after Elwood passed, for unrelated reasons mostly, but I will admit that holler stayed with me, and I've never once driven back up that road since, not even to visit his grave, which sits in a cemetery close enough that I could go, and I simply choose not to. I want to add one more detail that I have not mentioned yet, something I only learned about a year after Elwood passed, when I ran into his niece at a grocery store in Marlinton, and we got to talking. She told me that Elwood's father, decades earlier, had lost a young daughter, Elwood's older sister, who had wandered off from the house as a small child and was never found, despite a search that lasted the better part of a week and involved most of the surrounding hollers. The family always believed something in the woods had taken her, though nothing was ever proven. And the niece told me that the salt lines across the doorways had started with Elwood's father right after that, a practice he never explained fully to his own children, beyond telling them it was for protection and that they were not to ask further questions about it. I also spoke briefly and somewhat reluctantly on her part with the coworker I mentioned earlier, a woman named Priscilla Owens, who took over several of my clients in that same general area after I left the agency. She told me that on a visit to a different elderly client, in a separate holler about 6 miles from Elwood's old property, she had heard that same scream, distant but unmistakable, once you have heard it up close the way I had, and that her own client, an elderly woman living alone, had simply nodded when Priscilla asked about it, and said only that it came around every so often and had done so for as long as she could remember, treating it with the kind of weary acceptance that I think only comes from a lifetime of living alongside something you cannot fight and cannot fully explain to anyone who has not lived it themselves. I still keep a small tin of salt in my car now, which I know probably sounds strange coming from someone with a nursing background who trusts evidence and medicine over superstition in nearly every other part of her life. But I have found that some experiences do not respect the boundary between rational and irrational quite as cleanly as we would like them to. And after what I saw and heard in that yard, and after what Priscilla told me about her own client in that other holler, I have decided I would rather carry a small, harmless habit with me than dismiss something that two separate people in two separate locations, independently described in nearly identical terms, without ever having spoken to each other about it beforehand. Scout the dog lived another 4 good years after that night, fully recovered, though Elwood told me the dog never again went out into that yard after dark, without being called firmly at least twice, standing at the threshold and staring out into the tree line for a long moment first, every single time, like he was checking to make sure it was safe before committing to stepping off the porch. I sometimes wonder what became of that thing after Elwood passed, and the house sat empty for a stretch before his family sold it. Whether it kept coming back to a place with no one left inside to hear it, or whether it moved on to some other quiet holler where an old man or woman still sits alone near a window at dusk, watching a tree lean the way generations before them were taught to watch it, out of a caution none of us ever fully explained to ourselves, and none of us were ever quite wrong to keep. Story 3. My name is Odell Pruitt, and for about 15 years, I made my living as an estate picker, which means I bought furniture, tools, quilts, old photographs, and other belongings from estate sales, often traveling deep into rural parts of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee to find pieces before the bigger auction houses got to them. It is a strange job in some ways. You spend a lot of time in dead people's houses going through what they left behind, and you develop a certain relationship with death that most people never have to think about, at least not the way I did. I've handled wedding rings still sitting in their velvet boxes, letters written decades ago and never sent, entire attics of photographs nobody left alive could put names to anymore. And over the years, I built up what I thought was a fairly thick skin for that particular kind of sadness. Most of the time, it is just sad, ordinary sad, the kind that comes from seeing a life folded up into boxes, a set of reading glasses left on a nightstand, a calendar still marked with appointments that will never be kept. That kind of sadness I learned to carry a long time ago, the way anyone in a job that touches death eventually does. But there was one call that was different, and I've never been able to talk myself out of what I saw that day, no matter how many times I have tried. I got a call from a woman named Bridget McAllister, whose grandmother had passed away in a farmhouse up near the Tennessee border, in a hollow so far off the main road that I had to leave my truck at the bottom of the hill and walk the last quarter mile because the road had washed out and never been repaired. Bridget told me on the phone that her grandmother, a woman named Opal, had lived alone in that house for almost 60 years, and that the family wanted the house cleared out before they sold the land, and that I could take whatever I wanted so long as I hauled it all myself. When I got up to the house, Bridget was there with an older man, her uncle, who did not say much and would not go inside with me, choosing instead to sit on the porch the entire time I worked, smoking cigarettes and watching the tree line behind the house with an expression I did not understand until later. Bridget told me her grandmother had passed only 4 days earlier, and that the family had noticed something strange in the last week of Opal's life, something they had not talked about much beyond themselves, but which Bridget felt she needed to tell me before I went inside alone. She said that in the final week, Opal kept insisting there was a large black bird outside her bedroom window every single night, tapping at the glass, and that on 2 occasions, a neighbor who came to check on her reported hearing what sounded like an old woman's voice coming from outside the house, speaking in a low, wet mutter, even though Opal herself was inside, in bed the whole time, confused and frightened by the sound. Bridget also mentioned, almost in passing, that in the last day or 2 before Opal passed, her grandmother had stopped talking about the bird altogether, and instead kept saying she felt lighter than she should, as if something were being taken from her a little at a time, a detail Bridget had not thought much of until she said it out loud to me, standing on that porch, and heard how strange it sounded once spoken to another person. I want to pause here and remind you, if you have not subscribed to Park Ranger Files yet, now is a good time, because we are about to get into the part of this story that I still cannot fully explain, and I would hate for you to miss the next one. Also, if you know anyone who loves true horror stories from the mountains, send them this video. It genuinely helps us grow. All right, back to Opal's house. I spent most of the afternoon going through the house alone, which did not bother me at first. It was a typical old farmhouse. Low ceilings, a wood stove in the front room, quilts stacked in nearly every closet. The kind of place that had absorbed decades of a single life into its walls. It was around 4 in the afternoon, with the light already starting to slant low and orange through the windows, when I went into the back bedroom, which Bridget had told me was her grandmother's room, the room where she had passed. The window in that room faced the tree line directly behind the house, and sitting on the sill outside, on the wrong side of the glass, from where any bird should reasonably be able to perch without falling, was a large black bird, bigger than any crow or raven I had ever seen up close, with its head cocked at an angle that looked almost human, watching me through the glass. I did not think much of it at first, beyond a mild unease, until I noticed its eyes were not black, like a bird's eyes should be, but a pale, milky color, almost like cataracts. And it did not fly off when I moved toward the window, which every wild bird I have ever encountered would do instinctively. I have spent plenty of time around barns and old properties over the years, enough to have a decent working knowledge of how crows and ravens behave around people. And every instinct, built from that experience, was screaming at me that this bird's stillness was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I have since learned about a figure from Cherokee tradition called the Raven Mocker, described as a kind of witch, often appearing elderly and unremarkable in daylight, who is said to steal the remaining years of life from the dying, sneaking in around the time of a person's death to take what is left of them before they can pass on peacefully, and who is said to sometimes appear in the shape of a large black bird, making a sound like an old woman's voice as it flies. I had never heard of this before that day, and I want to be honest, when I later described what I experienced to a woman who grew up in that region and knew the older stories, she went very pale and told me I should not have gone into that room alone. The bird tapped once against the glass, a single deliberate tap, and then made a sound that I can only describe as a wet, rattling laugh, low in pitch, that did not belong to any bird I have ever heard, before dropping off the sill and out of sight. I finished my work in that room faster than I had finished any other room in that house, and I did not look at the window again. While I was packing up a small dresser near the bed, I noticed for the first time a faded quilt still draped over the mattress, and folded into one corner of it, tucked half beneath the pillow, was a small cloth pouch that I later learned from Bridget had belonged to her great-grandmother, filled with what turned out to be a mix of dried herbs and a few small stones, something Bridget described as a protective charm passed down through the women in her family for generations, always kept close during illness or at the end of life. I did not touch it, and I told Bridget about it before I left that day, so the family could decide what to do with it themselves, which felt like the only right thing to do, given everything else that had happened in that room. It was later that evening, loading the last of the furniture into my truck bed at the bottom of the hill in the dark, that I heard it again. That low, wet muttering sound, close behind me in the trees along the trail. And this time it was forming words, or something close enough to words that my mind kept trying and failing to make sense of them. A string of syllables that almost sounded like my own name being said wrong, twisted slightly, the way you would say a name if you had only ever heard it once through a wall. I quickened my pace down that trail more than I would like to admit, boxes and all, and I did not once look back over my shoulder, and telling myself the entire way that whatever was following along in the trees would lose interest the moment I reached the truck and the open road beyond it. A bit of self-reassurance that felt thinner and less convincing with every step. Bridget's uncle, still sitting on the porch when I made my final trip up to grab the last box, caught my eye as I passed and said only one thing to me the entire day. He said, "That thing has been coming around every night since Mama passed, waiting to see if anybody else in this house is close to going too. And I did not sleep good until I heard you loading up your truck, because I was worried it might follow you instead of staying here. I have not taken a job that far off the main road since, and I will admit that when I go into an elderly person's home now for estate work, I check the windows before I check anything else. And if I ever hear a bird tapping on glass in a room where someone recently passed, I do not go in that room alone, not ever again." I ended up keeping in touch with Bridget a little after that, mostly through occasional messages, and about 8 months later, she told me something that has stuck with me since. Her uncle, the quiet man who had sat on the porch the entire day refusing to go inside, passed away himself not long after, and in the final days before he died, according to Bridget, he told the family he kept hearing tapping at his own window at night, and asked more than once if anyone else could hear the birds outside, even though it was the dead of winter, and no birds of any kind should have reasonably been active in that cold. Bridget told me she has never been able to shake the feeling that whatever came for her grandmother came back around for her uncle too, drawn to that same family, that same house, patient enough to wait for the next one whose time was close. I looked into the Ravenmacher legend more after that conversation, reading through what collected accounts I could find from Cherokee oral tradition and from folklorists who had documented stories from elderly community members decades ago. Nearly every account I found described the same core detail: that the creature could be recognized by the elderly and infirm sensing its presence, even when others in the room could not, and that its true monstrous form was rarely seen except by the dying themselves in their final moments, everyone else only catching glimpses. A bird at a window, a shadow at the tree line, a voice that did not belong to anything they could identify. That matched uncomfortably well everything Bridget had described to me about her grandmother's final week and everything I experienced myself in that back bedroom. I do not take estate jobs involving very recent deaths anymore, if I can help it, and if a family tells me their loved one passed within the last week or two, I ask as tactfully as I can manage if someone else can be present in the house with me while I work, a request that has occasionally earned me strange looks, but one I no longer feel any need to apologize for. I still buy furniture and belongings from estate sales all across that region, and I still find genuine joy in the history each piece carries with it, but I have developed a habit since that day of asking a few more questions up front than I used to, gently probing about how recently someone passed, and under what circumstances, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a real hard-earned caution that did not exist in me before I stood in that back bedroom and watched a bird with milky eyes tap once against the glass and laugh at me in a voice that did not belong to anything with feathers. There are certain houses I still drive past on my routes through that part of the mountains. Ones I know sat empty for a stretch after an elderly resident passed, and I catch myself glancing at the windows every single time, half expecting and half dreading to see something perched there, patient, waiting on whoever moves in next to have their own turn drawing close to the end. That is the story of Opal's farmhouse, and I still think about that milky-eyed bird more than I would like to admit. If this one got to you, drop a comment and tell us. We genuinely love reading your reactions and theories. Make sure you are subscribed to Park Ranger Files so you never miss a story. Give this video a like if you made it to the end, and we will see you in the next one. Story 4. I have worked as an independent storm chaser and documentary photographer for about 9 years, selling footage to local news stations and occasionally to national outlets when a storm is severe enough to make bigger headlines. I got into this work after studying meteorology in college, and while most of my classmates went into forecasting jobs at local news stations or with the National Weather Service, I found I preferred being out in the field, close enough to feel a storm's raw energy rather than simply modeling it from behind a desk. Most of my work happens out in the plains, but there's a smaller, dedicated community of us who chase Appalachian storm systems too, which behave very differently because of the terrain, the way a storm can hit a ridge, and do things that flat land storms simply cannot do. This happened 3 years ago in a rural stretch of Garrett County, Maryland, close to the West Virginia border, during a severe thunderstorm system that the Weather Service had flagged as having tornado potential, given certain rotation patterns showing on radar. I was out with my usual setup, dash cam, a couple of external cameras mounted to the truck, and a handheld camera I kept beside me for anything worth capturing up close. I had pulled off onto a gravel turnout, along a ridge road that gave me a clear view down into a valley where the storm cell was tracking. And I want to be clear that I have filmed dozens of severe storms from similar vantage points without anything unusual happening. This one was different from almost the first minute. I remember checking my radar app one final time before stepping out to set up the tripod, noting the rotation signature the Weather Service had flagged, a fairly ordinary supercell structure for that time of year, nothing in the data itself suggesting anything beyond a normal, if potentially severe, thunderstorm. The storm had an unusual green tint to the underside of the clouds, which chasers sometimes associate with hail potential, nothing inherently alarming on its own. But as the leading edge of the storm crossed over the ridge above me, I started hearing something underneath the thunder, a low, mechanical-sounding hiss, almost like steam escaping a pipe, rhythmic in a way that weather has no business being rhythmic. I remember thinking it might be some kind of industrial equipment on a nearby property, a compressor or something similar, until the sound got noticeably louder as the storm moved directly overhead. I actually stepped out of the truck at one point, camera still rolling on the dash, and walked a short distance along the turnout, trying to visually locate whatever piece of equipment might be producing that sound. Some part of my brain still clinging hard to a rational explanation, even as the hiss grew loud enough to compete with the thunder itself, and finding absolutely nothing nearby that could account for it. No barn, no compressor shed, nothing but empty pasture, and the dark tree line beyond it. Wind was already picking up hard enough to make standing outside the truck a genuinely poor decision from a basic storm safety standpoint. And I remember a small professional part of my brain scolding me even as I stood there, reminding me of every safety talk I have ever given to newer chasers about not letting curiosity override good judgment near an approaching supercell. There is old folklore from that specific region, straddling Maryland and West Virginia, about something called the snaily gaster, described across different old accounts as part bird, part reptile, sometimes described with a metal or armored-looking body, and said to be drawn to storms, appearing in the clouds or descending with severe weather, with that same hissing, screeching call people described as almost mechanical. I had heard the name before, mostly as a joke, a piece of old Americana folklore that towns sometimes use for festival names and beer labels. I did not think of it as something with any weight behind it until that night. Through a gap in the storm clouds directly above the ridge, lit by a long, rolling flash of lightning that lasted long enough for my camera to catch several frames of it, I saw something descend partway out of the cloud base, a shape with a long, narrow body and wings that did not move like bird wings, more like something being unfolded and refolded in sharp mechanical segments, and a head that ended in something between a beak and a set of jaws, metallic looking even in the brief lightning exposure, catching the light in a way that skin or feathers simply do not catch light. If you have ever seen night lightning catch off wet metal, that is the closest comparison I have for how its body reflected that flash, a hard, cold glint rather than the soft absorption you would expect from feathers or scales. And I remember my hands going still on the camera for a moment, forgetting entirely to keep filming, before some professional instinct kicked back in and reminded me why I was standing out there in the first place. And I want to remind you here, if you are enjoying this story, drop us a comment telling us your favorite piece of Appalachian folklore. We read every single one, and sometimes we build future episodes around what you all suggest. Also, if you have not liked this video yet, now is a good time before we get into the worst part. The thing let out a sound that my audio equipment actually caught clearly on the recording, a screeching hiss that set off every car alarm within about a quarter mile, mine included. And it descended low enough over the valley that I lost visual on it behind the tree line, though I could track its rough position by the way the storm's lightning activity seemed to cluster and intensify wherever it moved, almost like the storm itself was reacting to it rather than the other way around. I made the decision, and I will admit now it was not a smart one, to follow the storm's movement along the ridge road in my truck, trying to keep visual and audio contact for footage, something I have done with actual weather phenomena, more times than I can count without incident. About 2 miles down that ridge road, my truck's engine cut out completely, along with every electronic system in the vehicle. Dash lights, radio, everything, in the middle of driving, coasting to a stop on a road with a steep drop-off on one side and dense forest on the other, in the middle of a severe thunderstorm, at night, was something I could not fully explain, circling somewhere close by. I sat in that dead truck for what the timestamp on my handheld camera later showed was almost 11 minutes, though it felt considerably longer in the moment. And during that time, I heard the hissing screech pass directly overhead at least 3 times, close enough that the truck shook slightly each time. And on the third pass, my handheld camera, which I'd kept running the entire time on battery power separate from the truck's electrical system, caught something landing briefly on the road ahead of me, visible only as a dark shape against the headlights of a vehicle that had pulled up behind mine. Another chaser I did not know personally, who had been following the same storm system and had the sense to stop well back from my dead truck. That other chaser, a woman I later spoke with briefly online but never met in person, described what she saw through her own windshield as a shape roughly the size of a large dog, but with a wingspan far wider, folding its wings down against a long segmented body before it moved off the road in a low, scuttling run that she said reminded her uncomfortably of a large insect rather than any bird or reptile she could name, disappearing back into the tree line just as suddenly as it had appeared. She told me that in the brief moment it was illuminated by her headlights, she caught sight of its head turning toward her vehicle, and that its eyes reflected her headlights, back not white or yellow the way an animal's eyes typically do, but a deep red that seemed almost to glow rather than simply reflect, and that the sensation of being looked at by it, even from inside a locked car, was enough to make her lock her doors a second time out of pure reflex despite already being locked. My truck's electrical system came back online almost as abruptly as it had failed. All at once, dash lights flickering back to life, the radio crackling with a burst of static before finding its station again, and I did not waste any time getting off that ridge road. I reviewed the footage days later with a couple of chaser friends who I trust, and while the recording itself is genuinely inconclusive, mostly dark shapes and reflections that could theoretically be explained away, the audio is not something any of us have been able to explain. That mechanical hissing screech layered underneath the thunder, rhythmic in a way that no storm has ever produced on any other recording I have captured in 9 years of doing this. I still chase storms for a living, and I still work in Appalachian Trail more often than not because the footage sells well and I genuinely love the work. But I no longer chase anything through Garrett County or the immediate area around that ridge, and if a storm system tracks through there with any unusual radar signatures, I let it pass without me, which is something I never used to do before that August night, no matter how bad the weather got. I ended up sharing that audio clip, stripped of any identifying location information, with a small online community of weather enthusiasts and cryptid researchers who overlap more than you might expect. And the responses I got back genuinely surprised me. At least 6 other people independently replied describing nearly identical hissing screech sounds captured on their own storm footage or scanner recordings over the years. Most of them also from storms tracking through the Appalachian corridor, stretching from Maryland down through West Virginia and into Western Virginia, an area that keeps coming up again and again in these old regional accounts of the Snallygoster, going back over a century, including newspaper reports from the early 1900s, describing a creature matching that same description terrorizing farms in that exact region Reports that were eventually dismissed by later generations as an elaborate hoax cooked up by a newspaper editor looking to sell papers. Though I have to say, having heard what I heard and seen what I saw, I'm no longer as confident in that hoax explanation as most people seem to be. The woman who stopped behind my dead truck that night, the one who saw it land briefly on the road, reached out to me again about a year later to tell me she had experienced something similar a second time, in a different location entirely, this time in Garrett County again, but further north, and that she had made the decision after that second encounter to stop chasing storms in mountainous terrain altogether, sticking exclusively to flat, open plains chasing from that point forward, telling me plainly that some storms in some places are not worth whatever might be riding along inside them. I still have that dash cam footage saved on 3 separate hard drives in 3 separate locations, a habit I picked up specifically because of that night. Some part of me convinced I need to preserve it in case it is ever the piece of evidence that finally makes someone take this seriously. My truck itself was never quite the same after that night either. Small electrical quirks that a mechanic I trust could never fully diagnose, dash lights that flicker occasionally for no clear reason, a radio that sometimes finds static on a frequency it has no business finding out where I live now. I traded that truck in eventually, telling myself it was simply due for an upgrade, though if I'm honest with myself, I was glad for an excuse to stop driving something that had been sitting dead on that ridge road, with that thing circling somewhere close by in the dark. I still check radar obsessively before every chase now, not just for rotation and hail potential, but for anything that strikes me as slightly wrong in a way I could not have named before that August night, a kind of instinct I never had in my first 6 years of doing this work, and one I trust completely now, no matter how it sounds, when I try to explain it to other chasers who have not lived through their own version of it. Story 5, E.M. Colleen Vasquez. And for close to 20 years, I've worked as a traveling piano tuner and organ technician, which is a smaller and stranger profession than most people realize. One I fell into almost by accident after studying music in college and discovering I had more patience for the technical, mechanical side of instruments than for performing on them myself. I do not just service pianos in people's living rooms, though I do plenty of that too. A good portion of my work over the years has involved servicing pipe organs in older churches scattered throughout rural Virginia, North Carolina, and parts of Tennessee, many of which are historic buildings, some over a century old, often sitting mostly empty except for a small aging congregation that gathers once a week and cannot always afford regular maintenance, which is where someone like me comes in, usually hired for a single visit rather than any ongoing relationship with the building. Most of these congregations are small enough that they simply cannot justify a maintenance contract, so they save up and call someone like me maybe once every 5 or 10 years, which means the instruments I work on tend to have accumulated a lot of neglect by the time I finally get my hands on them, and a lot of history along with it. The job I want to tell you about happened at a small Baptist church up in the mountains outside of town in western North Carolina, a building that the congregation told me had been built in the 1890s, with a pipe organ almost as old as the church itself, one that had not been properly serviced in longer than anyone currently attending could remember. I was hired by the church council to come in on a Thursday, work through the day and likely into the evening given how much needed doing, and let myself out when finished, since the nearest deacon lived almost 30 minutes away and did not want to make a second trip out that night. I arrived around 10 in the morning and the work was extensive. More extensive than I had been led to believe over the phone, and by the time the light outside had started fading, I was maybe 2/3 finished, faced with a decision most tuners in my position would recognize: either stop for the night and lose the momentum of a job that requires a lot of careful listening across many hours to get right, or push through and finish it properly, while everything was still fresh in my ear. I chose to push through, which meant I was alone in that church well past dark, working mostly by the light I had brought myself since the building's electrical system was old and unreliable in the sanctuary itself. though the small vestibule and the stairwell leading up to the bell tower had working lights on a separate, newer circuit that had apparently been added at some point for safety reasons. Around 8 in the evening, I started hearing something moving above the sanctuary ceiling. Footsteps, unmistakably footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing back and forth in the space between the sanctuary ceiling and the roof, an area that, as far as I knew, should have been nothing but old rafters and insulation. Not a space anyone could comfortably walk through, let alone pace back and forth in the way I was hearing. I want to remind you here, if you have not already, drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. And if you have ever worked alone in an old building at night and heard something you could not explain, tell us about it in the comments below. We read every single one of them. Now, back to that church. I told myself, the way anyone does in that situation, that it was probably an animal. Raccoons are common in old church attics, or a structural settling sound. Old wood buildings make plenty of unexplained noises as temperatures shift after dark. I kept working, though with considerably more attention on the ceiling than on the organ pipes in front of me. The footsteps continued for close to 20 minutes, crossing and recrossing the same general area above the choir loft before stopping directly above where I was sitting at the organ bench. Then I heard something being dragged, slow, heavy, with an occasional pause. The unmistakable sound of something being pulled across old wood flooring above me, moving toward the bell tower stairwell that opened off the vestibule I had walked through hours earlier. I remember sitting very still at that organ bench, hands resting on keys I was too frightened to press, listening to whatever it was descend the first few stairs of that tower with slow, deliberate steps, before stopping again, this time somewhere I judged to be just inside the vestibule, close enough that if I stood up from the organ bench and looked through the sanctuary doorway, I would very likely be able to see it. I did not stand up. I sat at that organ bench for almost 40 minutes without moving, listening to something breathe, slow and wet sounding, from somewhere just beyond the sanctuary doorway, occasionally shifting its weight in a way that made the old floorboards groan under something considerably heavier than a person. I have thought many times since about what would have happened if I had made a sound, dropped a tool, anything, and I'm genuinely thankful I never had to find out. At one point, near the end of those 40 minutes, I heard something that I still have no good explanation for. A low, tuneless humming, almost like someone trying to recall the melody of an old hymn without quite remembering the notes correctly, drifting from the same direction as the breathing, faint enough that I could have almost convinced myself I imagined it if it had not continued steadily for nearly a full minute before fading out along with the breathing itself. My hands, resting on the organ keys the entire time, had gone completely numb from how tightly I was gripping the edge of the bench, and it was not until much later, driving away from that church, that I noticed deep half-moon marks pressed into my own palms from my fingernails, a detail that told me more about how frightened I truly was in that moment than my own memory of it ever could. Eventually, and I could not tell you exactly how long this took, because time behaves strangely when you are frightened, the breathing sound retreated, the floorboards near the vestibule went quiet, and I heard very faintly the outer door of the church, the heavy wooden one at the main entrance, open and close on its own, without the sound of footsteps crossing the gravel lot outside that I would have expected from anything walking normally on 2 feet. I did not finish the organ that night. I packed my tools as quietly and quickly as I've ever packed anything in my career, left through a side door near the choir loft rather than the vestibule, and drove straight to a motel almost 40 minutes away rather than the closer accommodations the church had originally arranged for me, and I did not sleep more than an hour or two before daylight. I called the head deacon the next morning to explain as diplomatically as I could manage that I needed to reschedule the remainder of the work, and it was in that conversation that he told me, somewhat reluctantly, that the church had a history he had not mentioned when he hired me, involving a previous caretaker decades earlier who had died in a fall from that same bell tower, under circumstances that were never fully explained, and that several members of the congregation over the years had reported similar experiences of hearing something moving through the building alone at night, always described the same way: footsteps overhead, something being dragged, and finally that same wet, heavy breathing sound near the entrance. He told me the previous caretaker's name had been a man named Silas Ledbetter, and that according to the older members of the congregation, Silas had been deeply particular about the church, obsessive even, about who was allowed inside after hours and how the building was treated, and that some of the older folks believed, whether or not they would say so outright to a stranger, that Silas in some form had never actually left, and that he did not take kindly to anyone working in that church alone after dark without his presence being acknowledged somehow. A small offering left, a word spoken toward the tower before starting work. Traditions that had apparently fallen out of practice with each newer generation of caretakers and hired workers who did not know to observe them. I did finish the organ eventually, though I made sure to schedule the remainder of the work during full daylight hours only, arriving early and leaving well before dusk, and I made a point, feeling slightly foolish about it even as I did it, of speaking a few words toward that bell tower stairwell before I began each day's work, something simple, just acknowledging that I was there to help the building, not to intrude on anything. I did not hear footsteps again during either of the 2 remaining days I spent finishing that job, though I will admit I never fully relaxed inside that sanctuary again, and I have declined similar jobs at older, isolated churches more than once since then, citing scheduling conflicts that were not entirely true. Curiosity got the better of me a few months later, and I drove out to the small local historical society housed in the county courthouse to see what I could find about Silas Ledbetter and that church. I found a short obituary from decades earlier confirming his death, listing the cause only as a fall, and a longer article from the same era describing him as the church's longtime caretaker, a man who had reportedly lived in a small caretaker's cottage on the church property for over 30 years, never marrying, dedicating what the article described as his entire adult life to the maintenance and preservation of that building. A handwritten note tucked into the same file, apparently from a previous historical society volunteer, mentioned local rumors at the time of his death that Silas had confronted a group of teenagers who had broken into the church after hours to drink and cause mischief, and that his fall from the bell tower had happened during or shortly after that confrontation, though nothing was ever proven and no charges were ever filed against anyone. That detail changed something for me. I no longer think of what I experienced that night as something malicious in the way I originally assumed. I think Silas, in whatever form he still occupies that building, is not interested in harming people who come to help maintain what he spent his whole life protecting. I think he is interested in being acknowledged, in not being forgotten or ignored by the people who now do the work he used to do. And every caretaker or worker I have since spoken with who has had any kind of experience in that building describes the same thing: footsteps, a presence near the tower, and then nothing further so long as some small courtesy is extended, a word spoken, an acknowledgement made. I still do this work, and I still love pianos and old organs more than almost anything else in my life. But I am considerably more careful now about which buildings I agree to service alone, and considerably more willing to believe an old building might remember exactly who built it, who cared for it, and who it still considers, in whatever way something like that can consider things, to still belong to it. I keep a small notebook now, separate from my regular work log, where I jot down a line or two about any building that gives me an unusual feeling before I even start working. A habit that started as a joke with myself and has since become something closer to a genuine precaution, one I do not plan on giving up anytime soon. I have since told a handful of other piano technicians and organ tuners I know professionally about that night, carefully testing the waters before revealing the full story. And I was surprised to find that at least 2 of them had their own version of a similar experience in a different old church somewhere else in the mountains. both describing footsteps overhead and a heavy waiting presence near an entrance, both having developed their own small private rituals for acknowledging whoever or whatever still considers those buildings home before beginning work alone. It has made me wonder how many old churches scattered through these hills are quietly, patiently occupied by someone who spent their whole life caring for them and simply never agreed to leave. Story 6. I run a small commercial beekeeping operation, though for a stretch of about 4 years, I also did contract pollination work, moving hives seasonally to different farms and orchards throughout eastern Tennessee to help pollinate crops in exchange for either payment or a share of the honey production, which is a fairly common arrangement in that line of work. One that let me build relationships with dozens of small growers across the region who could not otherwise afford to keep their own hives year-round. In the fall of that 4th year, I took on a contract with an old apple orchard property up in the mountains, owned by a family who had let most of the orchard go semi-wild over the past couple decades, only harvesting a small portion near the house while the rest of the trees, maybe 20 acres worth, had grown out untended, tangled with other forest growth that had crept in around the edges. The owner, an older man who mostly kept to himself and let me handle the hive placement without much oversight, told me when I arrived that the back section of the orchard, closest to where the tree line became true forest climbing up the ridge, had a section the family always avoided, an area with a handful of very old, gnarled apple trees that predated the rest of the orchard by what he guessed was at least a century, planted, according to family stories passed down, by whoever had originally settled that land long before his family bought it generations back. He told me almost as an afterthought, while helping me unload equipment, that his grandfather always said not to keep bees too close to those old trees, though he could not tell me why. Only that it was something that had been said in his family for as long as he could remember. One of those pieces of inherited caution nobody bothers to question because questioning it never seemed necessary. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I did not think much of at the time, that the family dog, a border collie mix that normally ranged freely across the entire property, had never once in its whole life set foot past a certain line of fence posts that roughly marked the boundary of that back section, always stopping there and turning back on its own without ever being trained or commanded to do so. A piece of animal instinct the family had simply accepted without much discussion over the years. I filed that detail away without thinking too hard about it at the time, chalking it up to nothing more than an unusually territorial dog with a strange habit, the kind of small oddity every rural property seems to collect over enough decades. And it was not until weeks later, standing at the edge of that grove myself, that I finally understood the dog had simply known something the rest of us had not yet learned the hard way. I placed my hives, about 18 of them, throughout the healthier, tended part of the orchard, keeping a respectful distance from that old grove simply out of practicality more than superstition, since bees generally do better foraging on younger, more productive trees anyway. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded normally, hives were active, foraging well, honey production looking strong for the season. It was in the 3rd week that I started noticing something wrong with several of the hives closest to that back section, a behavior I had genuinely never seen in over a decade of keeping bees. The bees in those particular hives had started what beekeepers sometimes call balling, clustering tightly together in defensive formations, except they were doing this not in response to any threat I could identify, and not around their queen the way defensive balling normally happens, but instead clustered tightly against the inner walls of the hive boxes, facing toward that old grove of apple trees, as if orienting themselves toward something out there that I could not see or sense myself. I checked those hives for the usual culprits first: mites, disease, a queen problem, anything that might reasonably explain unusual defensive behavior. And every test I ran came back completely normal. Healthy brood pattern, healthy queen, no signs of pests or illness of any kind. which only made the behavior more unsettling rather than less, since it meant whatever was driving it was not coming from inside the hive at all. I want to pause here because this next part is where things stopped being simply strange and started being genuinely frightening. And if you are still with me, drop a like on this video. It really does help the channel. And let us know in the comments if you have ever kept animals that reacted strangely to something in the environment around them. Because I know a lot of you have similar stories from farms and rural properties. Okay, back to the orchard. I went out to check on those particular hives around dusk one evening, which is generally not ideal timing for hive inspection, since bees are less active and more defensive as the day cools. But I wanted to observe the behavior directly, rather than relying on daytime checks that never quite captured it in full. As the light faded, I noticed the bees from those hives were not returning to the hive boxes the way they normally would as evening set in. Instead, small clusters of them kept flying out toward the old grove, low in a strange weaving pattern I had never observed in any healthy colony, more like they were being pulled towards something, rather than foraging normally. I followed the general direction of that flight pattern on foot, staying well back from the actual tree line, and it was in the deepening dusk light that I first heard the sound, a low humming that at first I genuinely mistook for the sound of my own bees, until I realized the pitch was wrong. Too deep, too steady without the natural variation a real swarm produces as individual bees move at different speeds and distances. It was coming from somewhere within that old grove, a constant unbroken hum that did not rise or fall the way any actual insect activity does. Standing at the edge of that grove, in light that had gone mostly gray and blue with the sun down behind the ridge, I could see, hanging from one of the lowest branches of the nearest old apple tree, something that at first registered in my mind as an unusually large hive or swarm cluster, dark and roughly bulbous in shape, until I looked longer and realized it was not attached to the branch the way a natural swarm cluster would be, hanging instead in a way that suggested it was simply resting there rather than built there. And it was, very slowly, breathing, the entire mass expanding and contracting with a rhythm that did not match any insect behavior I'd ever studied. As it expanded outward on one particularly deep breath, I thought I saw just for a moment something pale catch what little light remained in the sky, a shape embedded somewhere within that dark mass that looked disturbingly like the curve of a small hand, fingers slightly spread, before the mass contracted again and swallowed whatever I thought I had seen back into the shadow of the branch. I want to be clear that I do not know what that pale shape actually was, and I have spent a fair amount of energy since then trying to convince myself it was a trick of fading light on wax or dead leaves caught within the mass, though that explanation has never quite managed to settle the feeling in my stomach the way I would like it to. I did not go any closer. I want to be honest that every instinct I had told me to leave immediately, and I did leave, walking backward most of the way until I felt comfortable turning around. And I did not sleep well that night, going over what I had seen and trying to explain it away with any rational beekeeping knowledge I had, none of which fit what I had actually witnessed. The orchard owner, when I described it to him carefully the next morning, went quiet for a long moment before telling me a story he said his grandfather had told him as a boy about something the old settlers in that area apparently called the hive. Not a specific named creature exactly, more a kind of local legend about something that lived deep in old growth trees and could mimic the sound and shape of a swarm to draw bees, and sometimes people, close enough to feed on something the old stories never specified clearly, only that anyone who got too close to those old trees in the evening was never quite the same afterward, prone to strange dreams and a lingering unease that never fully went away. I relocated every hive on that property within 4 days, moving them to a different section of orchard nearly a half mile from that old grove. and the bawling behavior stopped almost immediately once the hives were moved, colonies returning to completely normal activity within about a week. I finished out my contract that season, staying well clear of that back section for the remainder of my time there, and I have never taken another contract on that property since, despite the owner asking me back the following 2 years in a row. Curiosity kept nagging at me long after I moved those hives, and I eventually reached out to a folklore professor at a university in Tennessee who had published a few papers on regional agricultural legends. When I described what I had seen and heard, careful to leave out identifying details about the property, she told me she had encountered similar accounts twice before in her research, both times from old orchard or farming families in isolated mountain communities, both describing an old, untended section of trees that livestock and animals avoided instinctively, and both describing some version of that same low, breathing hum reported by witnesses who got close enough to hear it. She told me her working theory, offered cautiously, since this sits well outside anything she could publish formally, was that these stories may share roots with older regional beliefs about certain trees or groves being what some traditions call hungry ground, places that draw and consume small amounts of life force from anything that lingers too long nearby, with the swarm mimicry potentially being one specific localized variation of a much older and broader piece of folklore found in different forms throughout Appalachian communities. I spoke with the orchard owner one final time before ending my professional relationship with that property for good, and he told me something his grandfather apparently said once and only once near the end of his own life, which was that those old trees had been there long before his family ever settled that land, and that whatever grew among their roots was, in his grandfather's words, older than the mountain remembers being young, a phrase that has stuck with me in a way I cannot fully explain, turning over in my mind at odd hours ever since I think about that low, steady hum more than I would like to admit, and about the way that dark mass breathed against the branch in the fading light, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world and knew exactly what it was waiting for. I do not know what it actually was, and I'm genuinely not sure I want to know. But I trust my bees, and my bees wanted nothing to do with whatever was living in those old trees, and that has been good enough reason for me to stay away too. I have kept bees for a long time since that season, all across different farms and properties throughout eastern Tennessee, and I have never once experienced anything like that bawling behavior again, which I take as some small comfort, a sign that whatever lived in that particular grove was tied specifically to that place, and not something that follows a hive or a keeper once you leave. Even so, I find myself watching my bees a little more closely than I used to at the start of any new contract, checking for that particular defensive clustering in the first few days at a new property just in case. And so far, every single time, they have given me nothing but good news. I still think, more often than I would like, about that owner's phrase, older than the mountain remembers being young, and about how many other quiet, overgrown corners of these hills might be holding something similar, something old enough and patient enough that it has simply never needed to announce itself to anyone who did not wander close enough to hear it breathing. If this story left you with a strange feeling about your own backyard trees, you are not alone. Plenty of people in the comments on our other episodes have said the same thing. Subscribe to Park Ranger Files for more true accounts like this one. Give this video a like if you made it all the way through, and we will see you in the next story. Story 7. My name is Earl Higgins, and I spent most of my working life as an electrician before retiring early and moving out to a piece of land I had bought years earlier, specifically because of its isolation. 40 acres bordering national forest land in a county that still had several old coal mining operations scattered throughout it, most abandoned since sometime in the middle of the last century, sealed up with concrete portals, or simply left to collapse in on themselves over the decades. I had always wanted a piece of land far enough from town that I could see real stars at night without any light pollution, and that part of the property, at least, delivered exactly what I was looking for. I built a cabin, set up a solar power system, and got heavily into amateur radio as a hobby, both for the genuine enjoyment of it and because living that far off grid meant reliable communication mattered more to me than it might to most people. I want to explain a little about ham radio for anyone who is not familiar, because it matters for what happened. As an operator, you spend a lot of time scanning frequencies, listening for other operators, sometimes picking up signals from very far away, depending on atmospheric conditions, weather, time of day, and a dozen other variables that affect how radio waves travel. You get a feel over years of doing it for what normal signal activity sounds like, the particular hiss and crackle of empty frequencies, the way a distant voice fades in and out, the specific quality of interference from things like power lines or storms. I had been operating for close to 15 years by that point, held an extra class license, the highest tier available to amateur operators, and had logged contacts with other operators on every continent except Antarctica, which I only mentioned to make clear that I was not some newcomer easily spooked by unfamiliar static or an unusual atmospheric skip. It was early December, deep into a stretch of unusually cold weather, when I first picked up something on a frequency I had scanned countless times before without ever hearing anything unusual on it. It came through faint at first, beneath the normal static, a rhythmic tapping sound, evenly spaced. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again, repeating in a pattern too consistent to be random interference and too mechanical sounding to be an animal or natural cause. I remember sitting at my equipment that first night for almost 2 hours trying to figure out what I was hearing, adjusting frequency, checking my equipment for faults, ruling out every explanation I could think of. Old-timers in that part of West Virginia, men who had worked the mines themselves or whose fathers and grandfathers had, have a name for a phenomenon miners used to report hearing deep underground, a tapping sound that seemed to come from within the rock itself, sometimes described as helpful, warning miners of impending cave-ins by tapping just before a collapse, and sometimes described as something considerably less friendly, a sound that lured miners deeper into unstable sections of tunnel from which they never returned. They called this the Tommyknockers, and it is one of the oldest pieces of mining folklore in Appalachia, going back to when Welsh and Cornish immigrant miners brought similar legends with them from their own countries, and the stories took root and evolved in the Appalachian coalfields. I had heard of Tommyknockers before, mostly as old mining superstition, the kind of story you hear at a county fair booth about local history, and I did not initially connect what I was hearing on my radio to any of that folklore, mostly because I could not fathom how a radio signal, which requires some kind of transmitter to produce, could possibly be coming from inside a mine that had been sealed for the better part of a century. If this story is starting to give you that crawling feeling, that is exactly what we love to hear about down in the comments. So let us know. And if you have not subscribed to Park Ranger Files yet, now would be a great time because the story keeps going and it does not get any less strange. Also, drop a like on this video if you are enjoying it. It genuinely helps us out. Okay, back to the signal. Over the following 2 weeks, I picked up that same tapping pattern almost every night, always around the same hours, roughly between 11 at night and 2 in the morning, always on that same specific frequency. And I started keeping a log, timestamps, duration, any variation in the pattern, partly out of genuine scientific curiosity and partly, I will admit, because writing it down and treating it like a technical problem to solve helped keep the unease at bay. About 10 days in, the pattern changed. Instead of the steady 3-tap sequence, I started hearing something underneath the tapping, faint, garbled, that took me several nights of careful listening to identify as a human voice or something doing a very good imitation of one, speaking in short bursts between the taps, words I could not make out clearly, except for fragments that sounded unmistakably like my own name. On one particularly clear transmission, close to 1 in the morning during a stretch of unusually still cold air that I have since learned can improve certain kinds of signal propagation, I managed to make out what sounded like a second voice, layered faintly beneath the first, lower, slower, repeating what I eventually convinced myself was a string of numbers, possibly old mine coordinates or shift markers, though I was never able to match them to anything in the historical records I later reviewed. My hand, I noticed only after the transmission had already ended, had been resting on the tuning dial the entire time without my conscious awareness. Fingers pressed hard enough against the metal that they ached afterward, as though some part of me had been trying, without my permission, to reach back through the equipment toward whatever was speaking on the other end of it. I want to be honest with you about how deeply unsettling that was. Hearing something on an empty frequency at midnight, from a source I could not locate or explain, saying what sounded like Earl over and over, wrapped inside that same mechanical tapping pattern. I checked and rechecked my equipment obsessively during that stretch. Had a friend who is also a longtime ham operator come out and listen to it himself to confirm I was not imagining things, which he did confirm, hearing exactly what I described and being just as unable to explain it as I was. The mine nearest my property, one of several in the area but the closest by a considerable margin, sat maybe half a mile from my cabin as the crow flies, sealed with a concrete portal decades before I ever moved out there, according to county records I looked into afterward. I want to be very clear that I did not go looking for that mine entrance in the dark, alone, driven by some need to investigate the source of a radio signal, because I recognize how badly that decision could have gone, and how many horror stories start with exactly that kind of decision. What I did instead, after almost 3 weeks of these nightly transmissions, was contact a mining historian affiliated with a university extension office who specialized in the history of abandoned coal operations in that county, hoping he could tell me something about the specific mine that might explain what I was hearing, even if the explanation turned out to be mundane, some kind of old equipment still generating a signal somehow, anything rational. He told me something I was not prepared for. That particular mine had been the site of a partial collapse in the 1940s that had trapped several miners underground, and while most of the bodies had eventually been recovered during rescue efforts, official mining records from that era, which he had access to through his research, indicated that at least 2 miners were never recovered. The section of tunnel they had been working in judged too unstable to continue rescue efforts after several days, and it was sealed off from the rest of the workable mine, with the 2 men's names never publicly released by the company at the time, a common and unfortunately callous practice for coal operators of that era, trying to avoid liability and bad publicity. He was able to find, after some searching through old county records, the names of the 2 men believed to have died in that section, and I'm not going to say their names in this video out of respect for their memory. But I will tell you that neither of them was named Earl, which should have been some comfort and somehow was not, because it meant whatever was saying my name into that radio frequency at midnight was not simply some echo of a dead miner calling out his own name in confusion, but something that knew my name specifically, something aware enough of me and my presence on that land to reach out toward me directly. The tapping and the voice continued for another full week after that conversation with the historian, and then on a night in early January during a particularly severe cold snap, it stopped abruptly in the middle of a transmission, the tapping simply cutting off mid-pattern rather than fading out the way it normally did toward 2 in the morning. And I've never picked it up again on that frequency since. Not once in the years I continued living on that land afterward, despite scanning it deliberately many times, hoping, and also dreading, that I might hear it again. I posted a heavily edited clip of that recording, with identifying details stripped out, to an online forum for amateur radio operators, mostly hoping someone with more technical expertise than me could offer a rational explanation involving signal bounce, atmospheric ducting, or some kind of equipment malfunction I'd overlooked. What I got back instead were 3 separate messages from other operators, all from different states, all describing eerily similar experiences of picking up unexplained tapping patterns or voices on isolated frequencies while living or operating equipment near old mining regions. 2 of them specifically in West Virginia and 1 in eastern Kentucky. None of us could offer each other anything close to a satisfying technical explanation, though comparing notes did at least confirm for me that I was not simply losing my mind alone out there in the cold and the dark. The mining historian I spoke with also mentioned something in a follow-up email that I think about often, which is that Tommyknocker folklore, across its long history in Appalachian coal country, was never entirely consistent on whether the phenomenon represented something malevolent or something protective, with plenty of old miner accounts describing the tapping as a genuine warning that saved lives before a collapse, and others describing it as something that lured men into danger rather than away from it. He told me he suspected, based on his own years of research, that whatever the phenomenon actually is, it may not be uniformly one or the other, but something that responds differently depending on circumstances none of us fully understand, which is not a comforting thought, but it is the most honest one anybody has offered me about what happened out there that winter. I still live out there, still keep up with amateur radio as a hobby, and I still, if I'm honest with you, feel a small knot of tension every single night around 11 o'clock. An old habit my body has never quite let go of, listening for 3 taps and a pause that I have not heard again in years. And some part of me suspects that whatever was reaching out through that frequency either found what it was looking for elsewhere or simply ran out of whatever strength or will it takes for something like that to keep reaching across all that distance and all that time, trying to be heard by someone, anyone, still living on the surface above where it remains. I have thought many times about sealing up my radio setup entirely, walking away from the hobby altogether, but something in me has never quite been able to do it. Some stubborn part of me that wants to be listening if it ever does come back, whether that is bravery or foolishness. I honestly could not tell you anymore. My cabin still sits half a mile from that sealed mine portal, close enough that on very still winter nights, I sometimes catch myself standing outside for a moment before bed, looking toward the dark tree line in that direction, listening for something I hope I never hear again, and cannot quite convince myself I actually want to stay silent forever either. I have never gone looking for that concrete portal in daylight either, which some of you watching might find surprising given how much time I have spent thinking about it. But I have decided there are some questions a person is better off not answering, and whatever spent those 3 weeks in early winter trying to reach me through a dead frequency and a wall of sealed rock is one of them. Story 8. I've driven long haul for 21 years, mostly regional routes through West Virginia, and western Pennsylvania, hauling everything from produce to construction materials. I know those roads better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Every grade, every blind curve, every stretch where cell coverage drops out completely for miles at a time. I want to tell you about a night almost 4 years ago, driving a stretch of 2-lane highway that runs alongside the Tigard Valley River in Taylor County, West Virginia, hauling a load of lumber late at night because the delivery window required an early morning arrival. It was close to 1 in the morning, no other traffic on the road for the better part of 20 minutes. The kind of quiet that becomes its own kind of loud once you have been driving alone long enough. I had my CB on low volume, mostly static that time of night, and my headlights were the only real light source for miles, the river running black and silent off to my right through gaps in the tree line. I saw it first as a smudge of white in my peripheral vision, off in a clearing near the riverbank, maybe 80 yards out. I slowed down without really deciding to, the way you do when something registers as wrong before your conscious mind catches up. What I saw standing at the edge of that clearing was something roughly the size and shape of a large man, but entirely white. Not pale-skinned white, but a flat uniform white all over. Without any clear features I could make out even as I got closer. No obvious face, no clothing, just a smooth white shape standing dead still, facing the road. If you have never driven those back roads in West Virginia at night, I want you to understand how genuinely isolated some of those stretches are. No houses for miles, spotty cell service, nothing but river, trees, and a two-lane road cut into the hillside. I slowed the truck down further, foot easing toward the brake without me fully deciding to. And I watched that white shape in my mirrors as I passed it. And I swear to you, it turned to track me, rotating in place, no visible legs moving, like it pivoted on some axis I could not identify. I have driven past deer standing frozen at the roadside more times than I could count over 21 years. And there's a specific quality to how a startled animal moves, quick and instinctive, that this shape did not have at all. Its rotation was slow, almost deliberate, like it had all the time in the world and no particular urgency about tracking a truck passing through what it clearly considered its own territory. I have since learned that people in that specific area have reported something almost exactly like this for decades, going back to the 1960s, an amorphous white creature that locals sometimes call the Grafton Monster after the town nearby, said to be seen along that same river corridor, described in old newspaper accounts as headless or featureless, moving without visible limbs, sometimes leaving behind an odor described as chemical or metallic. What struck me most, reading through those old accounts later, was how many of them mentioned effects on nearby vehicles or electronics. Headlights flickering, engines briefly stalling, details that matched what happened to my own CB radio so closely that it stopped feeling like coincidence somewhere around the fourth or fifth account I read. I want to remind you here, if you are enjoying this story, drop a like and subscribe to Park Ranger Files. It genuinely helps us keep making these. Now, back to the road. I kept driving, watching my mirrors more than the road ahead for longer than was safe. And about a quarter mile further along, my CB radio, which had been nothing but static all night, suddenly crackled with what sounded like breathing, slow and wet, coming through clearly enough that I grabbed for the volume knob to turn it down out of pure reflex. Underneath the breathing, I heard something that might have been a voice, low and garbled, repeating something I could not make out, 3 or 4 syllables over and over, and it did not stop even after I killed the radio power entirely, continuing faintly through the dashboard speaker for almost 10 more seconds before finally cutting off. I did not stop that truck until I hit a fuel station almost 45 minutes later, and I sat in the cab with the doors locked for a solid 10 minutes before I trusted myself to get out. I filed no incident report, told no dispatcher, and the only person I told that entire week was my wife, who believed me without hesitation, mostly because it was not the first strange story she had heard from drivers in that specific corridor over the years, just the first one that had happened to me directly. I remember her asking me carefully whether I had gotten a good look at its face, and I had to admit that in all the adrenaline and fear of that drive, I genuinely could not recall seeing anything resembling a face at all, only that smooth, featureless white surface, a detail that unsettled her more than almost anything else I told her that night. I have gone back over the delivery logs from that job more than once since, checking timestamps against my own memory, and the math always comes out the same. I lost close to 15 minutes somewhere along that stretch of road that I genuinely cannot account for, minutes that should have been spent simply driving at a steady speed, but which my arrival time at the next scale house does not fully explain. I have never brought this up with dispatch, since a missing 15 minutes on a log is the kind of thing that gets a driver pulled aside for a conversation nobody wants to have. But it has stayed with me privately in a way the sighting itself almost has not. A nagging sense that something about that stretch of road does not simply want to be seen, it wants time from anyone who passes through it. I have talked to other drivers since, carefully, without leading them, just asking if anyone had ever seen anything strange along that river road, and I've gotten 3 separate accounts over the years describing something white and featureless near that same stretch, always at night, always near the water. And at least one other driver described the same wet breathing sound coming through his radio afterward, which is the detail that convinces me none of us were simply imagining things alone in the dark. I still drive that route when dispatch assigns it to me, because refusing would raise questions I do not want to answer, but I do not stop for anything short of an emergency along that stretch anymore. And I keep my radio off entirely once I pass mile marker 14, choosing silence over whatever might come through those speakers again. I did some digging on my own time after that, mostly late at night when sleep was not coming easy anyway, and found archived newspaper articles from local West Virginia papers going back to the early 1960s, describing sightings along that same General River corridor, always describing something white, featureless, and silent, sometimes associated with an unusual smell, sometimes with strange effects on nearby electrical equipment, car radios cutting to static, headlights flickering without cause. One article quoted a local resident from decades ago, describing almost exactly what I experienced, a shape that seemed to track a passing vehicle before receding back toward the river, and reading that account alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m. was enough to keep me from sleeping the rest of that night. I mentioned all of this once, carefully, to a fellow driver who has run that same regional route even longer than I have, an older man close to retirement, and he went quiet in a way that told me everything before he said a single word. He eventually admitted he had rerouted himself around that stretch entirely years earlier, taking a longer, less efficient path, specifically to avoid it, and that he had never once discussed his reasons with dispatch, always simply citing traffic or road conditions instead. Hearing that from someone with that many more years behind the wheel than me did more to convince me I had not imagined any of it than almost anything else could have. Story 9. My name is Priya Chandrasekaran, and for 9 years, I worked as a professional caving guide, leading both commercial show cave tours and smaller, more technical wild cave expeditions for experienced spelunkers looking for something beyond the paved and lit tourist paths. Wild caving is a different world entirely from the show caves most people picture. No handrails, no electric lighting, just headlamps, ropes, and a deep respect for a system that has been carving itself out of limestone for longer than human beings have existed as a species. The incident I want to tell you about happened in a wild cave system near the North Carolina and Tennessee border, one I had guided small groups through probably 30 times over the years without a single serious problem. I was leading a group of 4 experienced cavers on what should have been a straightforward 6-hour route, descending through a series of chambers we had all traveled before, working our way toward a lower gallery known among local cavers for a particularly striking formation of flowstone. About 4 hours in, deep enough that we were easily 800 feet below the surface entrance, our lead caver, a man named a good 10 feet ahead of the rest of us, stopped suddenly and put a fist up, the universal caving signal for silence and stillness. We all froze, headlamps illuminating a narrow passage that opened into a wider chamber just ahead of us. And in that silence, all 5 of us heard it at the same time, a soft, high-pitched sound coming from somewhere deeper in the chamber, almost like a child's voice, though muffled and strange, like it was being spoken through something that was not quite a normal human mouth. I want to explain something about deep cave acoustics because it matters here. Sound behaves strangely underground, bouncing and distorting in ways that can make a dripping stalactite sound like footsteps or a settling rock sound like a distant voice. And every experienced caver learns early on not to trust their ears completely in that environment. I told myself this immediately, tried to explain it away as water dripping somewhere in the chamber ahead, until our headlamps, sweeping across the space, caught movement along the chamber's far wall, low to the ground, something pale-colored ducking behind a rock formation faster than any of us could get a clear look. I remember my own headlamp beam shaking slightly as my hand tightened on the strap and I glanced at the caver beside me, an experienced woman who had been caving for close to 15 years, and saw her jaw set in a way I had never seen from her before on any previous trip. A look that told me she trusted her own eyes just as little as I trusted mine in that moment, and just as much as both of us actually did. If this story is giving you chills already, that is exactly what we love to hear. Drop a comment and let us know, and if you have not subscribed to Park Ranger Files yet, now would be the perfect time before this gets stranger. Alright, back into the cave. There is an old Cherokee tradition describing a group sometimes called the Moon-Eyed People, described as a small, pale-skinned people, said to have lived in the region long before other tribes arrived, associated in some accounts with underground dwellings and caves, and described as having eyes so sensitive to sunlight that they could only move about safely at night or underground in complete darkness. I had heard fragments of this legend before, mostly treated as an interesting piece of regional folklore, rather than anything I connected to actual caving, until that day in the chamber. Our lead caver, against every piece of good judgment any of us should have exercised, moved a few feet closer to the rock formation, where the shape had disappeared. And I want to be honest that all four of the rest of us called for him to stop, to fall back, none of us feeling good about pushing further into an unmapped section of that chamber, towards something we could not identify. He did stop eventually, after getting close enough that his headlamp beam swept directly across a gap between two boulders, and what he described seeing, and what two of the rest of us caught a partial glimpse of ourselves, was a pale, small figure, roughly the size of a child, but built with proportions that were subtly wrong, limbs slightly too long, crouched low with both hands pressed flat against the cave floor, and eyes that, even in that brief flash of headlamp light, were unmistakably larger and darker than any human eyes should be, reflecting our lights back with an intensity that made all of us instinctively look away. We retreated from that chamber as a group, moving faster and with far less caution than proper caving technique recommends, and none of us spoke much until we were well clear of that lower gallery, climbing back up through passages we all knew by heart, grateful for every foot of familiar rock beneath our hands. None of us needed to discuss the decision to retreat. It simply happened, a kind of unspoken group consensus that formed faster than any verbal agreement could have, each of us moving with the same urgent, controlled pace, roped together and trusting each other's judgment more completely in those minutes than in any previous trip we had shared. It was only once we were back at the surface entrance, blinking in daylight after nearly 7 hours underground, that our lead caver admitted he had heard, in the last few seconds before we retreated, that same high-pitched voice again, close enough this time that he was almost certain it had said a word, though he refused to tell us what the word sounded like until we were all sitting in a diner an hour away, safely surrounded by other people and ordinary light. I have thought often since about why that specific word affected all of us so deeply, more than any physical threat could have. And I think it comes down to the fact that nothing about that encounter felt predatory in the way we all instinctively expected something dangerous underground to feel. There was no snarl, no aggressive posture, nothing resembling the kind of threat display that even inexperienced cavers are trained to recognize and respond to. Instead, there was patience and an invitation, and something in that combination bypassed every instinct we had built up over years of managing fear in confined, dangerous spaces, replacing it with a different, harder-to-name kind of dread, the kind that comes from realizing a threat does not need to chase you if it is willing to simply wait. He told us quietly, staring at his coffee rather than at any of us, that it had sounded like the word down, repeated twice, in a voice that did not sound frightened or aggressive, just patient, almost inviting, the way you might call a child in from playing outside once it started getting dark. I have not led a tour through that particular cave system since, and when other cavers have asked me why, I have mostly given vague answers about liability concerns or simply losing interest in that road. because I have found that telling the full truth tends to end conversations rather than continue them. But I think about that pale figure often, about those eyes built for total darkness, and about a word spoken gently enough to sound like an invitation rather than a threat. And I have never once been tempted to find out what waited for us if we had accepted it. I reached out afterward to a few local historians and folklore researchers in the region, and learned that accounts of pale, nocturnal figures encountered deep in cave systems throughout the southern Appalachians go back considerably further than I had realized, with some collected oral histories describing similar encounters from cavers and even early coal surveyors going back well over a century, always in remote, unmapped sections of larger cave systems, always describing that same combination of small stature, oversized dark eyes, and an unsettling gentleness to whatever sounds or words witnesses reported hearing. One researcher told me she believed the consistency of these accounts across such a long time span from people who could not possibly have influenced each other's stories was more compelling to her than almost any other piece of regional folklore she had studied professionally. 2 of the 4 cavers who were with me that day have since given up the hobby entirely, something none of us have discussed openly as a group since, though I think we all understand, without needing to say it, that whatever we encountered in that chamber changed something fundamental in how safe we feel moving through darkness underground, a feeling that no amount of experience or technical skill has been able to fully restore. If Moon-Eyed people and their world beneath the mountains gave you a chill, let us know down in the comments. We want to hear your theories. Subscribe to Park Ranger Files for more stories like this every week. Give this video a like before you go, and we will see you in the next one. Story 10. My name is Jonah Whitmore, and I have worked as an arborist and tree removal specialist for almost 16 years, mostly serving rural properties throughout the southern Appalachians, where storm damage, disease, and simple old age take down trees that homeowners cannot safely handle on their own. Most of my work is unremarkable. Climbing, cutting, rigging heavy limbs down safely. The kind of physical, technical labor that becomes almost meditative once you have enough years of practice under your belt. I got into this work initially through a summer job clearing storm debris after college. And something about the combination of physical risk, careful planning, and working so closely with something that old and that alive kept me in the field long after the summer job itself ended, eventually turning it into the career I still practice today. I got a call from a family living on a large rural property outside Asheville, North Carolina, about a massive chestnut oak on their land that had started showing signs of serious internal decay, large sections of dead canopy, fungal growth at the base, the kind of tree that needed to come down before the next serious storm brought it down on its own terms, likely onto either the house or the barn, depending on which direction it fell. The homeowner told me, almost apologetically, that the tree was old enough it had been on the property since before his grandparents bought the land, and that removing it felt like losing a piece of family history, a sentiment I hear often enough in this line of work that I did not think much of it at the time. I want to describe the tree itself before I get into what happened, because its size matters for understanding what I found. It stood easily 80 feet tall, with a trunk diameter wide enough that it would have taken 3 adults joining hands to fully encircle it, the kind of tree that predates most human memory of that land, possibly even predating white settlement of the area given how old chestnut oaks of that size typically are. I began the removal process on a clear morning in early autumn, working with one assistant on the ground while I climbed and rigged the upper canopy for controlled removal. About 2/3 of the way up, I encountered a large cavity in the trunk, a hollow section common enough in old decaying trees, usually home to nothing more exciting than raccoons, owls, or bees. I want to remind you here, if you enjoy stories like this, subscribing to Park Ranger Files is free and genuinely helps this channel grow, so consider doing that before we get into the worst part. When I shone my headlamp into that cavity, expecting the usual signs of animal habitation, I instead found what I can only describe as a kind of nest, though unlike any animal nest I have encountered in over a decade and a half of this work. Constructed from woven strips of bark, animal bone fragments, and what appeared to be small bundles of hair, both animal and, disturbingly, what looked distinctly human in texture and color, tied off with thin cordage that did not look machine-made. Sitting at the center of that nest, undisturbed by my headlamp, was a small carved figure, roughly the size of my palm, crudely shaped but unmistakably humanoid. Its surface darkened and polished smooth in places from what looked like decades, possibly longer, of handling. I did not touch it. Something about the arrangement, deliberate in a way that felt distinctly wrong to disturb, kept my hands away from that cavity for the rest of the job, and I made the decision, unusual for me, to reroute my rigging plan to avoid disturbing that section of the trunk directly, taking the tree down in sections above and below the cavity instead, leaving that hollow portion largely intact until it was safely on the ground. Once the tree was down, I mentioned what I had found to the homeowner, expecting curiosity or mild interest, and instead watched his face go pale in a way that told me this was not entirely new information to him. He told me reluctantly that his grandfather had once mentioned, only once late in his own life, that the land the property sat on had been considered by earlier settlers to be tied to something older than the family's own history there, something local Cherokee families in the area generations back had specifically warned against disturbing, a spot they called by a name that roughly translated, according to his grandfather's account, to something like the watching place. Though the homeowner admitted he had always assumed this was simply old family superstition passed down without much real meaning behind it. That night, camped in my truck on the property to finish the job the following morning, rather than driving the hour back home, I woke sometime after 2 a.m. to the distinct sound of something moving slowly around the outside of my truck. Footsteps, unmistakably footsteps, circling at a slow, deliberate pace, pausing periodically as if listening. I did not get out to look. I sat perfectly still in the dark cab, hand resting on my phone in case I needed to call for help, listening to those footsteps circle my truck no fewer than 4 times over the course of nearly 20 minutes, before finally fading off toward the tree line where the fallen chestnut oak now lay in sections. At one point during that circling, the footsteps stopped directly outside my driver's side window for what felt like a full minute, close enough that I could hear what sounded like slow, deliberate breathing through the thin glass, and I remember focusing every ounce of willpower I had on staying completely motionless. Some deep animal instinct convinced that any movement on my part would draw far more attention than I wanted. I finished the job the next morning in full daylight, working quickly and without lingering, and when I hauled the wood away for processing, I made the decision, again unusual for me, to leave that specific hollowed section of trunk behind entirely, telling the homeowner I could not safely transport it due to internal rot, which was not strictly true but felt like the only honest thing I could tell myself in the moment. The homeowner told me weeks later in a brief phone call to settle the final invoice that he had eventually had that section of trunk buried on the property rather than burned or hauled off, following, he admitted almost sheepishly, some instinct he could not fully explain even to himself. I have not taken a job removing a tree of that size and age since without first asking the homeowner, as carefully and casually as I can manage, whether their family has any old stories about the land, a question that has occasionally gotten strange looks and occasionally gotten answers I genuinely wish I had never heard. I reached out to a professor of Cherokee studies at a university in the region a few months after that job, describing what I had found without giving away the exact location. And she told me that carved figures placed within hollowed trees, sometimes accompanied by bundled offerings of hair, bone, or bark, appear in a handful of documented regional accounts as markers for places considered spiritually significant or dangerous, sometimes tied to boundary lines between what older traditions considered safe, inhabited land and land that belonged to something else entirely, something older than any human claim to it. She was careful to note that this kind of practice varies enormously between different communities and time periods, and cautioned me against assuming any single explanation applied cleanly to what I had encountered. Advice I have tried to keep in mind even as my own imagination has filled in gaps her academic caution left open. I still do this work, and I still find genuine meaning in caring properly for trees, especially the old ones. But I approach very large, very old specimens with a deliberateness now that goes beyond ordinary professional caution, always working the crown down carefully, rather than opening the trunk itself if I can possibly avoid it, and always listening more than I used to for anything that does not sound quite like wind moving through branches. My assistant on that job, a younger climber I have worked with for several years now, has never fully believed the details I shared with him afterward about what I found in that hollow, mostly because he was working the ground crew that day and never got a direct look inside the cavity himself. Only my description of it relayed down through the radio. I do not fault him for his skepticism, and in some ways I almost envy it, since carrying the full memory of that carved figure and that circling presence around my truck has changed something in how I move through remote, isolated properties that I do not think I will ever fully get back, no matter how many uneventful jobs I complete between now and whenever I eventually retire from this work. Story 11. My name is Bethany Kowalski, and for almost 7 years I worked as a cook, an occasional waitress at a 24-hour diner just off a rural highway interchange, the kind of place that survives almost entirely on truckers, shift workers, and the occasional lost traveler passing through in the middle of the night. I worked the overnight shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, mostly because it paid a shift differential, and mostly because I have always been more of a night person anyway, more comfortable in that particular kind of quiet than most people seem to be. The diner sat at the edge of a wooded area, mostly second-growth forest that had reclaimed farmland decades earlier, with a dumpster enclosure out back, close enough to the tree line that raccoons and stray cats getting into the trash was a regular, unremarkable occurrence. I want to establish that up front, because what happened did not initially register as unusual, given how normal it was to see small animal shapes moving around back there most nights. It started gradually, over the course of about 3 weeks. This feeling of being watched while I worked the grill, which faced a large window looking out toward that dumpster enclosure and the tree line beyond it. I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye periodically, always at a distance, always gone by the time I looked directly at it. And I told myself for a long while that it was simply raccoons, or my own tired eyes playing tricks on me during the loneliest hours of an overnight shift. I mentioned it once, casually, to a regular customer, a retired trucker who stopped in most nights around 2 in the morning for coffee and pie, and he got noticeably quieter than usual, telling me only that he had heard stories about that particular stretch of highway for years from other drivers, though he would not elaborate further no matter how directly I asked, changing the subject back to the weather with a firmness that told me he had decided long ago not to discuss it further with anyone. The first time I got a real look at it was on a Tuesday night in late September, close to 3:30 in the morning, no customers in the diner at that hour, just me at the grill and my coworker up front handling the register and the coffee pots. I glanced up from the flat top and saw, standing at the very edge of the tree line, illuminated just enough by the diner's exterior floodlights, a small figure, roughly the height of a child of maybe 8 or 9 years old, but with a head noticeably larger than any child's head should be, swollen and rounded in a way that looked almost bulbous, watching the diner without moving. I want to remind you here, if you have not liked this video yet, now is a good time. And if you have your own strange encounter working a night shift job, we would love to hear about it down in the comments. We read every single one. All right, back to the diner. I have since learned about a piece of regional folklore, common throughout parts of Ohio and the Appalachian foothills, describing small, deformed figures, sometimes called melon heads, with different versions of the legend giving different explanations for their origin, some tying them to escaped or abandoned patients from old, poorly regulated institutions decades ago, others describing them as something older and less easily explained. But nearly every account agrees on the same basic description: small stature, oversized rounded heads, and a tendency to stay close to wooded, isolated areas, watching more than approaching. I did not tell my coworker what I saw that first night, mostly because I was not entirely sure I trusted my own eyes after nearly 4 hours into an overnight shift. But the sightings continued over the following weeks, always at roughly the same time, always at the tree line. Sometimes one figure, and on 2 occasions, what looked unmistakably like 2 of them standing close together, both watching in that same unnervingly patient way. The night everything changed happened in early November, a slow night with almost no customers, when I stepped out back to take the trash to the dumpster myself instead of waiting for my coworker to do it during a lull. I want to be honest that I had done this exact task probably 1,000 times over the years without incident, and I had no particular reason to expect that night to be different. As I swung the dumpster lid shut, I heard, close behind me, a small, wet clicking sound, almost like a tongue against teeth, and turned to find one of those figures standing not at the tree line this time, but at the very edge of the parking lot, no more than 15 feet from where I stood. Up close in the direct light of the parking lot floodlights, I could see it clearly for the first time, and I want to tell you honestly that its skin had a grayish, unhealthy pallor to it. Its eyes were dark and set slightly too wide apart beneath that oversized head, and its mouth, when it opened slightly to make that clicking sound again, showed teeth that looked uneven and too numerous for the small size of its jaw. It did not move toward me. It simply stood there, head tilted slightly, studying me with an expression I can only describe as curious rather than hostile, which somehow made the encounter more disturbing rather than less. Its fingers, I noticed, only in that frozen handful of seconds, were unusually long and thin compared to the rest of its small frame, and one hand hung slightly raised at its side, fingers curling and uncurling slowly in a small, almost absent-minded motion, the kind of fidgeting gesture that felt disturbingly human despite everything else about it that clearly was not. I do not remember consciously deciding to move, but I found myself back inside the diner, with the door locked behind me faster than I have moved in years, watching through the window as the figure remained in that same spot for almost another full minute before turning and walking in an oddly loping, uneven gait back toward the tree line and disappearing into the dark. I told my coworker everything after that, unable to keep it to myself any longer, and to my genuine surprise, she told me she had seen similar figures herself on 2 separate occasions over the years working that same shift, never telling me before because she assumed I would think she was losing her mind. We compared notes with a few other overnight employees who had worked there over the years and found at least 3 more accounts, all describing the same basic figures, all sworn to secrecy by their own fear of sounding unstable. I stopped taking the trash out alone after that night, always waiting for a lull when my coworker could accompany me, and I put in for a transfer to a daytime position about 4 months later, a shift change I had never previously wanted given how much I valued the quiet of overnight work, a quiet that had, by that point, become something I could no longer enjoy the way I once had. I still keep in touch with a couple of former coworkers from that diner, and one of them, still working the overnight shift there to this day, told me just last year that the sightings have continued periodically over the years. Always the same pattern. Figures at the tree line, occasionally closer to the dumpsters, never aggressive, always simply watching with that same unnerving patience. She told me the current overnight staff have developed an unspoken rule of never taking the trash out alone after midnight, a policy that started informally among the employees themselves rather than anything management ever officially sanctioned, passed down now to newer hires, without much explanation beyond a simple, just trust us on this one. I looked into local reports from that broader region afterward and found that melonhead sightings cluster specifically around a handful of counties known for old, poorly documented institutional history from decades past. And while I do not know which explanation for their origin is the correct one, if there even is a single correct explanation, I know what I saw standing at the edge of that parking lot. And I know it looked at me with something that resembled curiosity far more than any hostility, which somehow makes the memory both less and more disturbing every time I turn it over in my mind. I work days now at a different restaurant closer to my house, ordinary hours, ordinary customers, and I have found that I genuinely do miss certain things about that overnight world. The particular camaraderie that forms among people who choose to be awake while the rest of the world sleeps. The strange, unhurried quality. Certain conversations take on at 4 a.m. with truckers passing through from every direction imaginable. But I do not miss that tree line, and I have never once, in the years since, regretted trading that quiet for a shift where I know, without having to think about it, that nothing is standing at the edge of a parking lot watching me work. Story 12. My name is Marisol Fuentes, and I have worked as a licensed land surveyor for 14 years, mostly handling rural property surveys throughout West Virginia and Western Virginia. Work that regularly takes me deep into forested, undeveloped land, far from any road, often for days at a time, when a property boundary requires extensive fieldwork. I want to say up front that I am a methodical, detail-oriented person by both training and temperament, exactly the kind of professional whose entire career depends on trusting precise measurement over gut feeling, which is part of why what happened to me has been so difficult to fully reconcile. I was hired to survey a large, heavily wooded parcel outside a small community in Braxton County, land that had been in the same family for generations and was finally being subdivided for sale following an inheritance dispute. The property backed up against national forest land, isolated enough that I planned the job as a 2-day fieldwork trip, camping overnight on site rather than making the long drive back to town and returning the following morning. I set up a small camp near the center of the property on the first afternoon, close to a section of old-growth forest. The family had specifically asked me to document carefully, since a small portion of the boundary line ran directly through it and needed precise marking for the eventual sale. I worked through the afternoon without incident, running my measurements, setting temporary markers, the kind of methodical work that has always felt almost meditative to me, despite how physically demanding it can be. I remember thinking sometime in the middle of that afternoon how unusually quiet that particular section of forest was. No birdsong, no small animal movement in the underbrush. A stillness that I registered at the time only as pleasant rather than as the warning sign it turned out to be. It was close to dusk, packing up my equipment for the day, when I first smelled something distinctly unpleasant drifting through the forest. A strong, sulfurous odor that reminded me uncomfortably of rotten eggs mixed with something almost metallic underneath it. Strong enough that I actually checked my equipment bag, briefly wondering if something in my gear had somehow caused it, before realizing the smell was coming from somewhere in the trees ahead of me rather than from anything I was carrying. If you are enjoying this story so far, go ahead and drop a like. It genuinely helps us out. And if you have ever worked alone in isolated areas and encountered something you could not explain, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Now, back to that Braxton County property. I have since learned about a well-documented regional legend, sometimes called the Flatwoods Monster, or the Braxton County Monster, originating from a famous multiple witness sighting in that exact county back in 1952. describing a tall, humanoid figure with a distinctive greenish or grayish coloring, glowing eyes, clawed hands, and most notably, an association with a strong sulfurous or metallic odor lingering at the sighting location. I had heard the name in passing before, mostly treated as a piece of quirky, small-town history, commemorated with a local festival and a small museum, never something I connected seriously to my own work, until that odor hit me in the middle of that forest. I made the decision, given the fading light and the strength of that smell, to move my camp further from that section of trees rather than continue working. A decision I do not regret making despite how professionally cautious it might have seemed at the time. As I was relocating my gear, moving through fading light toward a clearer section of the property, I caught sight of something between the trees that stopped me completely in place. A tall shape, easily 7 feet if it was standing fully upright, though it appeared slightly hunched, with a coloring that in the dim light looked distinctly greenish-gray rather than any natural earth tone I would expect from shadow or vegetation. Its eyes, and I want to be precise here because this detail has stayed with me more vividly than almost anything else, were not simply reflective the way an animal's eyes catch light. They appeared to actually glow, a dull reddish orange, without any external light source to be reflecting from at that hour, visible even at the considerable distance separating us. It did not move toward me. It stood among the trees, watching, for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time, before simply seeming to recede backward into deeper shadow, not walking away exactly, more like it dissolved into the darkness of the forest the further it retreated. The sulfurous smell, which had been steadily building throughout that encounter, seemed to intensify sharply in the final moment before it vanished entirely, strong enough that my eyes actually watered before fading almost as quickly as the figure itself had, leaving behind only the ordinary sense of forest and river that had surrounded me all afternoon. I did not sleep at all that night, sitting fully alert in my tent with a flashlight in hand and my truck keys close by in case I needed to abandon the campsite entirely. And I want to tell you that the sulfurous smell lingered, faint but unmistakable, for hours afterward, drifting periodically on the night air even as I moved my tent a considerable distance from where I had originally caught sight of that figure. I finished the survey the following morning in full daylight, working quickly and giving that specific section of old-growth forest a wider berth than strictly necessary for accuracy, marking the boundary from a safer distance, using equipment that allowed for remote measurement rather than requiring me to walk directly through that stretch of trees. I submitted the survey without noting anything unusual in my official report, since there is no professional language available for describing what I actually experienced out there, and I have declined every subsequent job that would require me to work alone overnight in that specific county since then, citing scheduling conflicts that are, if I'm honest, entirely fabricated. I spoke cautiously with a few longtime residents of that area afterward, careful not to lead them with details of what I had seen, and more than one nodded knowingly when I simply asked if anything unusual was known to happen out in those particular woods, telling me, without much elaboration, that some families out that way still avoid certain stretches of forest after dark. A caution passed down through generations since that famous 1952 sighting, treated by outsiders as local color for a museum exhibit, but treated by the people who actually live alongside those woods as something considerably more serious. I still work as a surveyor, and I still love the solitude and precision of this profession more than almost anything else about my working life. But I carry a different kind of respect now for isolated forest land, a respect that goes beyond professional caution about difficult terrain, and one I do not expect to fully explain to anyone who has not stood in those particular woods themselves, watching something with glowing eyes recede slowly back into the dark. I eventually visited the small local museum dedicated to the 1952 sighting, mostly out of a need to feel less alone with what had happened to me, and spoke briefly with a volunteer there who has spent decades collecting accounts from residents and visitors alike. She told me without my needing to prompt her much that reports from that specific stretch of Braxton County Forest have never really stopped since the original well-known incident, just faded from wider public attention as the original sighting became more of a quirky historical footnote than an ongoing local concern, even as people who actually live and work in that area continued quietly to report similar experiences every few years, rarely to anyone outside their own immediate community. She also mentioned something that has stuck with me since, that in nearly every account she has collected over the years, witnesses describe the same detail I noticed myself, that the encounter never felt overtly aggressive, more like being observed by something that was simply curious about a presence passing through territory it considered its own. A description that offers a strange kind of comfort and an equally strange kind of unease in roughly equal measure, depending on which part of that memory I choose to sit with on any given night. I have kept the small handheld GPS unit I was using that day, the one that recorded my boundary markers and my movements throughout that job. And every so often, usually late at night when I cannot quite talk myself out of it, I pull up the data from that afternoon and evening, looking at the recorded track of my own movement through those woods, half hoping and half dreading that I will notice some anomaly in the data, a gap, a jump, anything that might confirm or explain what I experienced. So far, the data has always come back clean, precise, exactly what a careful surveyor's track should look like, which somehow makes the whole experience feel simultaneously more and less real every time I check it. If the Flatwoods monster gave you chills tonight, you are far from alone. This remains one of the most well-documented cases in all of Appalachian folklore, and we would love to hear your own theories in the comments. Subscribe to Park Ranger Files for more true accounts every single week. Give this video a like before you head out, and we will see you in the next story.